Lovely. I think we'll get started. So, hello everyone. Welcome to this British Pain Society webinar. I'll introduce myself. My name is Dr. Malhotra. I'm one of the pain consultants up in Liverpool, and I'm co-chair of the Education SIG here at the British Pain Society. A few slides to go through, and then we'll start the actual webinar. So it's important just to remind you all, though you're probably all quite familiar with the British Pain Society, having joined this webinar and been known about the webinar. But it's important to recognise what the aims of the British Pain Society are, and it's an important society given that it is the largest multidisciplinary society in the UK focused on pain medicine. You'll hopefully be aware and have seen some social media or chatted to colleagues, and you know that there is an ASM being held in the lovely Victorian town of Harrogate in April. Hopefully, spring will have arrived by then, because otherwise that picture doesn't really do justice to what we are going to expect in Harrogate. So we're going to have two speakers today. I'd be grateful if you could use the chat function to ask any questions, and I'll probably let both speakers deliver their talk, and then we'll have questions at the end, as I think some questions may be able to be answered by one or both of them. This has been recorded, and if you're into YouTube, you'll be able to see this recording tomorrow on the BPS channel. It's worth checking that out, see what other things are on there. You'll get an evaluation form. Please fill that in so that we can give you a certificate of this. And just remember that we'd be grateful if you didn't share any recordings of this without getting approval from the BPS and the speakers. So that's it in terms of housekeeping. People have already started to use the chat, which is fantastic. I'll let Anna start to get her presentation loaded, and I'll introduce her. So thank you very much to Dr. Anna Hood for joining us for this webinar today. Anna Hood is a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Manchester, just up the M62 from myself here in Liverpool. And she has lots of research interests, mainly focusing on pediatric pain, and particularly people who live with sickle disease, and also pain inequities. And she's going to give us a talk today. Thank you very much for joining us, Anna, and the floor is yours.
Perfect. Sorry, the drop down for the audio didn't come through straight away. So yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak today. I really appreciate it. And yes, I'll be talking about predominantly minoritized youth and chronic pain, and thinking about how we can address pain inequities. So I was invited to give an opinion piece. I think it was, yeah, last year now, around this time. And I really think it sort of highlights the work that I do. And it was entitled Racism in Pain Management Causes Needless Suffering. And so really thinking about how we can challenge racialized bias and real myths around pain experiences. And so really sort of that's sort of the thread of what I'm going to be talking about, but then also talking about how we, the work that I have done to be able to combat some of that. So I was a senior author on this paper. I can't believe it's like nearly 5 years old now, because it feels like it wasn't too long ago since we wrote it. But it was led by a wonderful colleague, Vanny Mather, and it was us really trying to think about pain outcomes, and that we have spent a lot of work, a lot of time, a lot of money thinking about individual processes, and not that those aren't critical. I think they, and the basis of how we understand pain, really thinking about cognitive, emotional, behavioral, and biological factors. However, and we've done a little bit of work, I think, here, and this still remains, but thinking about where an individual is placed in the world, in what society, in what structural system, we've done very little work. And thinking about the fact that individuals are a product and move through the world because of the structures and policies, social institutions, particularly healthcare institutions, if we're thinking about people living with pain. But also thinking about these systems of oppression, cultural stereotypes, language, and the social political climate. So all of these things go into and make up how an individual processes pain. And we posit that that makes a difference in their pain outcomes. And I always say, when I show this figure, essentially it's very static, obviously, it's on, on a PowerPoint screen, but I sort of think about it as a body of water. And that everybody sort of has to make their way through here. We all have to do it. But for some individuals, right, they are swimming and they are able to swim. Some individuals, they're in a boat, and that boat has a paddle. Some of the people are in a motorized boat, but other people are just really just trying to keep their head above water. And we have to think about the fact that for all individuals, those processes are different. If we, I think, at our detriment, if we don't consider the cultural and structural factors. This was a few years ago now, a headline in the New York Times and a story that they published. But I think the headline really highlights what I'm going to be talking about today, which is that pain in children is often ignored. For any of you, those of you who work with children, this is not news to you. But for children of color, it's even worse, right? So it's this compounding is what we see. So, most of my work, as it was in my introduction, is with children and young people living with sickle cell. Um, I've never done a talk where it hasn't been a new thing that I've explained what sickle cell is to somebody, or this isn't new to them. So I always start with this slide, which is that sickle cell is the most common inherited disorder in the world. And I'll say it again, the most common inherited disorder in the world, and it is the fastest growing inherited disorder in the United Kingdom. And so for individuals with sickle cell in the UK are predominantly of African and Caribbean descent, but this is just because they have alleles frequency is higher in those areas. And I always have the caveat that this is a geographic disease rather than a disease of race. So individuals happen to have black skin color because they come from the place where the allele frequency is higher. It isn't related to race in any way. Sickle cell is, affects different people in different ways. This lack of oxygen affecting the hemoglobin, changing the shapes of the red blood cells, making them not carry oxygen well around the body and blocking other red blood cells from getting where they need to be, can just affect all systems in the body. But almost always individuals describe feeling some pain at some point. And this is life not only life limiting but life threatening. So a VOC is a vaso-occlusive crisis, so a pain crisis. And for individuals who have more pain crises over their lifetime, we see a shorter lifespan for those individuals. So it has this real, long-term life limiting and life threatening effects. So just to describe, so some of the work that I've done is just getting individuals to describe their pain. And so I wanted to share that with you. Oftentimes I try to do presentations I can with people with lived experience. And so then I don't, I want to make sure their voices are still in the room. So one person described their pain as when the pain is at its worst, it's crashing over me, and then it recedes for a little, like an ocean current. The timing and intensity of the waves also varies, much like a burning pain. Another described it's like being continuously being stabbed, but the knife gets left in and it's moving it around. Also, it can feel like you're on fire from the inside out, but feels more like pins and needles on ecstasy. And finally, one person said, for me, it's a throbbing pain. The best way I can think to describe it is if a person were hitting it with a hammer covered in needles from the inside on a very sensitive bruise. So, as you can hear from these descriptions, the pain can be excruciating for individuals. And a study that, we're in the process of publishing was one aspect of it was looking at sort of these different descriptors of pain and seeing where individuals with sickle cell are describing their experience in their pain, what types of pain. So as you can see, throbbing and aching is really sort of common across all areas. But we see a lot of headache pain, obviously pain in the arms and abdomen as well. So it's really sort of across the body, different, and really these experiences, nociceptive and neuropathic experiences of pain. So one of the biggest challenges we find is that despite people describing their pain and those experiences, despite it being the fastest growing inherited disorder, and that individuals with sickle cell often experience pain. When they go to seek treatment for that pain, they're oftentimes not believed. And we had a key report called the No One's Listening report, entitled Purposefully. That was commissioned as a parliamentary report and led by the Sickle Cell Society. And they found evidence of substandard care for sickle cell patients admitted to general wards or attending A&E departments, low awareness of sickle among health professionals, and clear examples of inadequate training and insufficient investment in care, and frequent reports of negative attitudes towards sickle cell patients. And those experiences were often underpinned by racism. So, in terms of the thinking, I try to think about, what do we do? How do we move forwards? How do we make those changes? And there have been since that report some many clinical pieces that I've done, and happy to answer questions about that and in the end and during our discussion. But I'm going to focus today a little bit more on the research and what we've seen. So, as part of a team, this group of wonderful women, we put our work together to be able to think about how do we think about this? We're seeing these inequities. We're oftentimes seeing these inequities for individuals who are Black and brown. How do we think and conceptualize it? And so we came up with something called the restorative model, which I'll talk to you about. And we're a group of, so I'm a clinical psychologist by training, but we have anesthesiologists, physiotherapists, epidemiologists, clinical psychologists who work in both practice and research, sociologists. So we really wanted to come at this from a multidisciplinary lens to be able to understand and think about creating a model so we can start actually testing and looking at this. And so at the center of this model is a known phenomenon and established framework called the racism-based traumatic stress. And racism, so this isn't something that we came up with. We took it and thought, how will it does it apply to pain? And so racism-based traumatic stress, or RBTS, is significant emotional and mental injury caused by frequent uncontrollable, and that uncontrollable is key, racist experiences and encounters that can be stress-inducing with the potential to produce traumatic responses. And as you see, research has shown that there's both psychological and physiological symptoms. So if we think about any examples of RBTS, well, the summer of 2024 comes to mind for me. I was actually at a larger pain conference giving a talk at the time. So I was at IASP in Amsterdam and hearing these reports. And so you have a visceral reaction and as an individual of color. And I think most people do. And individuals we see with RBTS, you can be the direct recipient. So obviously you're having that recipient experience, but you can also have this, experience as being a person from that same group. So this vicarious experience, we see it generationally, right? So we know that individuals who've experienced racism go on in terms of weathering and actual change in their body, and that epigenetically changes individuals and their children. So racism-based traumatic stress gets under the skin. And it gets under the skin in many ways. And one of the things that we were doing with the restorative model is thinking that it gets under the skin and is one of the contributors to the experience of pain. And so, as I mentioned, RBTS and pain had not yet been explored when we developed the model. And so our model has a long name, which is racism exposure and trauma accumulation, perpetuate pain inequities, but advocating for change. And I think that's the key part. And that's why we consider it to be restorative. And so the restorative model is a novel conceptual model that integrates racism and pain and demonstrates how the shared contribution of trauma symptoms, so whether they come from RBTS or PTSD, and maintain and perpetuate chronic pain for individuals from racialized groups. And so this is a figure from the paper, our paper. This paper was published in the American Psychologist in 2023. But if you see our model of pain and sort of that biopsychosocial approach will obviously be familiar to many people. But remember, I was talking about those mechanisms of injustice going out and thinking as well, right? It's thinking about structural trauma. We know the relationship to trauma and the experience of pain, environmental triggers, and those generational traumas as well, right? And all coming into, situate and have the experience of psychological symptoms that often can sometimes manifest as PTSD. If we look at the model of racism, well, we have a biopsychosocial model as well. And framing that, we have structural, institutional, vicarious, cultural, and generational racism, similarly to what we have with pain. And then those also cause trauma and experience of trauma symptoms. And we're saying that for individuals who are minoritized within a community, particularly this model focused particularly on Black Americans, but I think lessons would be similar to the UK, is that we're thinking that these trauma symptoms come together and we see this chronic pain inequities. And we have this focus on individual processes, as I mentioned earlier, and this discounting of intersectionality, the idea that I come in front of you as a speaker, as a researcher, as a lecturer, but also as a Black woman who lived in the US for a long time, but also lived here in the UK and was born here. So I'm all of those things, and that all comes together to understand my treatment, assessment, and function. And so we believe there's this pathway to restoration, but it requires us thinking about these structural and institutional changes and valuing the idea that individuals, there's these individual differences and thinking about how we personalize and think for individuals in these cases. So at the center of the model is something called cultural humility. Cultural humility builds on what many of you might have heard of as cultural competence. The reason to build on cultural competence is really a laudable idea, and we needed it. We needed to start thinking that having a competence around culture was critical to treatment and care. However, competence gives the idea that individuals can become competent in another culture, can become the expert in the room rather than the person with a lived experience. And that is not good for the person with lived experience, and it's not good for the clinician or carer, because you can't actually become competent in all of those different things. That's too challenging. And we wouldn't want you to. We want the power to be there for at the individuals who's living with pain to share their experiences with us. And so that's where cultural humility comes in. It's a process of openness, humility, and self-awareness in a world where power imbalances exist. It strives for mutual empowerment and respect, and it's lifelong and infinite, and it's centered on that tight idea of self-reflection and self-evaluation. So, how can we think about applying the restorative model to research? I'm going to give some examples of my work. I was also part and led one part of a series called Confronting Racism in Pain Research that was published in the Journal of Pain a few years ago now. But essentially, thinking about this, and the second paper, which was led by my wonderful colleague Janelle Letson, highlighted many of the areas you can think about how to do that in research. So, I say this all in thinking about challenging times. As I said, I lived in the US for a long time. I'm a US citizen, so a lot of this comes into mind for me as well. This idea of this pushback of the ideas of what equity, diversity, and inclusion actually mean, and for the most part, actually not even thinking about it in a research term, right? And so I'll just talk about that for the next couple of slides. So I think it's important for us to not only push back on this, but also think about how does that actually affect science. So we have lots of misconceptions. So first, that DEI is socially political and frequently introduces bias in and reduces rigor in our work. And I say to that, no, I say to that, diversity is merely variability. We, as any quantitative scientist will know, we have the assumption of variability and heterogeneity in our statistical modeling, right? That our group isn't homogeneous. And particularly for human participant research in our models, we rely on variability. And if that is in human participants and we want to understand pain, then we need to have individuals from all groups. So in that pushback for me, it is that we have to have all individuals. It's not having in our research, and we have to sometimes focus on different groups so that we can really understand those groups at a deeper level. The other misconception is that around equity, right? But equity is just justice. In our ethical principles, we say we rely on those, and those are rooted in principles of justice. And there should be a fair match between those who bear the burden and those who receive the benefits of research. And we would be doing an injustice when we have when a benefit's denied or a burden is imposed unduly, or specific populations are excluded from research and then the potential benefits. And finally, if we think about inclusion, well, that's merely representation. And again, a thing that we want in our research. Research that samples only a subsegment of the population that suffers from a restricted range, and it threatens again the statistical models that we rely on. No non-representative samples or samples that don't include adequate numbers of the population are most at risk and danger of producing results. And in our case, in the research that we do, pain treatments that cause harm rather than help to population health. So, for my framing, even in these challenging times, I think we can really frame around what we want to think about for diversity, equity, inclusion, right? It is merely based on principles that we've already said we're interested in as scientists and as clinicians. It is that we want justice. It is that we require a sampling diversity, and we also want representation. So another thing that I've been involved in, I was one of the network members for Entrust P, which is enhancing trust in pain research, which some of you may have seen, which was led by Neil O'Connell, who is at the Brunel University. But we really were thinking about a trust and a framework for trustworthy evidence in pain. And there's many materials, so I encourage you if you're interested to click on the QR code here. But at our core, thinking about trustworthy research, you can see there's lots of different areas we were thinking about, but equity, diversity, inclusion, and making sure individuals with lived experience are involved in our research was critically important to this overall framework. That research cannot be trustworthy. It can't be at its most scientific and rigorous if we don't hear the voices of people living with pain, and if we don't make sure to uphold those principles of justice that I've just spoken about. As I said, we have a publication in the Journal of Pain, and we created, and I say we were the big we. Neil really led this work, but there's a very long white paper for those of you who are interested in all of the details, but also that we've created leaflets that can be used, but for different stakeholders, so for policy stakeholders, clinicians, and it's all there on the website. So finally, I just want to talk about some work that some of the students who've worked with me, Diana did this as part of her master's work. And we were really interested in thinking about specific barriers and facilitators. Why would young people from racialized groups, particularly Black groups, even want to be in the work that we do, right? With these, how do we put this together? So we made sure that we were working with a person with lived experience of pain, but we explored how we can build on and understand why they would want to join our work. And I just want to share some of their words. Sorry. Just to give you some ideas. So there were caregivers and young adults. They were 20 to 25 years living with chronic pain. Most of our recruitment was over social media. And we had a nice group in the young people, mix of women and men, but most of our caregivers were women, and then coming from different groups, and then also different pain experiences. So just in terms of some of the barriers to participation, Nathan said, whenever I try to apply for any research that has to do with me filling out a form for 30 to 45 minutes before actually being picked, that's a no-no for me. Angie said, assurance of anonymity is the key thing. It's not pleasing to know that your personal information will be displayed publicly. Aaliyah said, I like the idea of going through a community, like maybe my prayer group or something from the church. I think if it's done that way, it's safe and your privacy is still preserved. And Jeremiah said, when we have people from the same cultural backgrounds who feel safer discussing things, and then it's easier for them to understand the impact of cultural backgrounds towards chronic pain. And a couple of caregivers said, it would also be more beneficial if somebody explained that to a parent and say, this is really important because it's the first new drug in 20 years. We've had to fight to get the cost of it approved, but we're going to prove it's effective so it can still be funded by the NHS. And finally, one said, "Do you even care about me in the UK? You want me to take part in this, but you haven't even bothered to change the spellings." They were talking about the fact it was in American spellings. If you're not bothering, then why should they care about your research? So our implications, we really saw that there was this call to action to challenge existing research practices, that involving youth in every stage of the research process and developing infographics and animations. And so we're just in the process of finishing our infographic. But if for those of you interested to be, our animation is up on YouTube, and actually, excitingly, has already had about 10,000 views. So people are really seeing the work that we've done. Finally, just my postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Joseph Ramon Wan, has worked on different frameworks thinking about trauma experiences, particularly from an immigration point of view. And this was a topical review published in Pain this earlier this year, thinking about all of these different micro, macro, and societal systems and chronosystems that can go in to make the experience of challenging for individuals who are have an immigration status. And he looked in one study looking to look at anti-immigration attitudes. And one example of that questions was, would you say it's generally bad or good for a country's economy that people come to live here from other countries? And you can see this is an idea of the anti-immigration attitudes, with the lighter color being less anti-immigration and the darker being more anti-immigration. And unfortunately, as you can see, the United Kingdom was one of the highest in terms of anti-immigration attitudes. In most people, we had a 50-50 split of girls and boys, and there was chronic pain experience in about 13% of the population. But one of the things he saw was those anti-immigration attitudes were higher, and those experienced more prevalence of chronic pain for individuals who, when the anti-immigration attitudes were higher. And that was a differential relationship depending on whether individuals were from a high socioeconomic or low socioeconomic status. So this immigration framework is something we're building on as well, thinking about this challenge of immigration as an experience, also within that sort of structural barriers. So finally, I just want to say thank you for the time to talk, and I look forward to our discussion at the end. But really, all of my work seeks to have all people living with pain included in all parts of our research so we can develop treatments for all communities. And I said, I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thank you so much.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Anna, for a really interesting, a very thought-provoking talk. Hopefully that generates questions. Like I said at the beginning, if any questions, please put them in the chat and I will ask them to both Anna and Asim at the end. Thank you very much, Anna. Asim, if you can load up your talk. So I'll introduce you. So this is Asim Solomon. He is the other co-chair of the Education SIG with myself. He's a GP pain specialist working out of Bradford, and he's led on pain research at both local, regional, and national levels, and he's here to talk to us about culturally adapted pain management. Thank you very much, Asim.
Fantastic. Can you hear me okay, Raj?
Yeah, we can hear
Brilliant.
you well.
Thank you. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for giving up your time this evening. This session runs for about 20 minutes or so, so I'll move fairly quickly through, and there'll be some time for questions at the end. Excuse me. So, culturally adapted pain management is a topic perhaps in the pain community that's been circled around for many years without fully being landed on. So, today I want to give you something a bit more concrete, perhaps. Not a lecture on cultural sensitivity in general, but specific practical tools for perhaps our South Asian patients in the UK pain services, where perhaps there's a gap between the need and provision. So I'll be drawing on evidence on the work we've done with the Rethinking Pain Service in Bradford, and on kind of my daily clinical reality of being a GP as well. And so hopefully by the end, I want you to walk away with at least two things you can do differently from tomorrow. So this is just me, my conflicts of interest and my disclosures. I've worked with a couple of pharma doing some back pain education, contributed to the Flipping Pain campaign. I've led on some kind of sleep work with the RCGP and iDosia. And but one thing I do want to say is that my experience is kind of grounded in Bradford, where there's a massive, diverse, deprived kind of urban setting, and the evidence and approach is broadly applicable to different parts of the country. And I'll try and flag up if there's some local context as well. I work as a GP partner and trainer. I'm also an occupational health physician, and I do work with the nationwide charity Arthritis UK. Um, I did found the Rethinking Pain service way back in 2022, and I was a clinical lead for 3 years. But now I'm pain lead for the Bradford South and West Musculoskeletal Service. So we've got 6 sections to quickly cover in 20 minutes. And that involves things like why culture matters, what the South Asian pain experience is like, particularly around Bradford, what barriers to pain care perhaps there is, how we developed a culturally adaptive education in Bradford and how that's important, some practical clinical approaches to take away. So in this section, why does culture matter in chronic pain? Well, this is the real foundation, and it's worth stating it quite clearly because our services have often behaved perhaps as if it's not the foundation of good pain management. So we all know the Engel 1977 biopsychosocial model. It was a revolution at the time, and it moved pain care kind of beyond purely biomedical thinking. But there's a gap, isn't there? Perhaps culture sits across all 3 domains, and it's addressed in none of them explicitly. So consider perhaps what culture actually shapes in a pain consultation. For example, the language we use. So the word pain in English is quite clinical, quite neutral. The word dard, D-A-R-D, in Urdu suggests perhaps anguish, emotional and physical. Heaviness and pressure, words and idioms are how many South Asian patients describe what we would call neuropathic or nociplastic pain. If we're listening for burning and shooting and electric like, and the patient says there's a weight on my chest, we probably miss each other, don't we, entirely? South Asian populations are quite expressive. Stoicism is highly valued in many South Asian communities, particularly amongst the men. But distress must go somewhere, really, and often it can be present in a somatic form. Excuse me. I wouldn't call this a somatization disorder. It's more about cultural legitimate expression of psychological pain through a physical idiom. Traditionally, South Asian communities are meaning making. Faith, family, and community define how pain is interpreted. And we'll try and get into this a little bit further on. Now, the evidence is quite clear. South Asian patients are underrepresented in UK pain management programs. And we have to ask ourselves why that is the case. Ethnicity predicts disparities in both pain assessment and opioid prescribing. Culturally adapted intervention shows significantly better engagement and outcomes. So this is a niche issue in Bradford. It's important in Leicester, in Birmingham, East London. This is, a lot of our patient lists. So I want to touch upon the South Asian chronic pain experience. It's a high population in Bradford. And what does it actually look like clinically, and what do we often miss? So there's 3 domains here, my key clinical observations, and we'll go through them quickly. So somatic idioms like dard are the norm, not the exception. They're not vague complaints, they're quite precise descriptions within a different semantic framework. There's often higher rates of widespread musculoskeletal pain, and often they present later in their clinical journey because often there are barriers to help seeking, and these are real and beginning long before the referral process. Now, we're looking at it from a psychological context. South Asian communities and families are often a collectivist family structure, which often means that self-care and self-management is never purely individual. There's often people or families involved. For example, a woman who's a primary carer for her elderly parent and 3 children can't simply ask her to pace herself without perhaps her having to, negotiate amongst the entire household about what that actually means. And as touched upon intergenerational trauma, that's important, particularly for the South Asian community, where issues of partition were an issue, migration were in the 1960s and 70s, where there was issues around racism perhaps and settlement stress. these are all very real and embodied. And Anna touched upon the riots a couple of years ago now. The atmosphere in this country at this moment in time is quite tough for South Asian communities, as it is for all minority communities. It's not looking like it's getting any better. Um, a lot of my parents' generation arrived in the 1950s and 60s, so been around perhaps for nearly 50 to 60 years. And yet we're still getting fairly overt racism in the media from politicians, and it's not conducive to a healthy pain environment. The stigma around mental health is significant, and this often means that patients will resist any framing that sounds like it's psychological. Gender dynamics matter. Women's pain is more frequently minimized, both by services perhaps and within families. And then we get onto this idea or observation of a belief system, which is something we probably don't often ask about when we're taking a pain history. In Islam, pain is considered part of God's will or a test of faith. In Arabic, the term is ibtila. Some people would describe that perhaps as fatalism. It's not that. It's a way of understanding and making a framework mean something. Patients often use traditional remedies, Ayurvedic medicine, Unani medicine, herbal treatments. Often they go hand in hand with any pharmacological treatments that are prescribed by their GP or secondary care doctors. Compliance may be an issue with quote unquote Western medicines. They often try to seek help within a system that they trust, but can often feel let down. Community and religious leaders are often trusted voices, as well as perhaps the GP. So we need to perhaps network with these communities and religious leaders, perhaps, to set up support groups for patients who have chronic diseases, including chronic pain. So I want you to think about perhaps a patient that you may have come across recently and just think about where they would fit into these clinical observations and whether perhaps you did inquire about their home situation, about their belief system, and if not, perhaps what are the barriers to that? And it'd be interesting to get your comments as well about what are the barriers to asking about someone's spirituality, perhaps their belief system or their culture. So swiftly moving on to perhaps some of the barriers that are involved with high quality pain management, because I guess understanding the patient's experience is only half of it. We also need to kind of honestly look at what services what we're doing and what we're providing, and perhaps what we're not doing and what we should be. So perhaps there's three levels of barrier, and I want to kind of be quite direct on this, because with our audience members, we probably have a fair bit of control with how we can shape services. From a system level, there's often simple barriers like materials not provided in Urdu, websites not being translated. Other languages are massive across the country: Punjabi, Hindi, Bengali, Gujarati. We should be providing information to a level that's absolutely normal now. Group pain management programs, do they take into account things like prayer times, the diet, or the fact that there may be some gender differences and preferences? Interpreter services, although more commonly used now, are they still underused in our pain consultations? How many times have we got an interpreter on our telephone calls if we're struggling with a patient perhaps who's come as a asylum seeker who may not be able to speak Urdu or Punjabi, English, may have Arabic, for example, or Kurdish? And where's the representation in our multidisciplinary teams for Asian patients? From a clinician level, we know there's implicit bias in pain assessment, and it's been well documented, both here and in the US. We perhaps underestimate pain in patients who present quite stoically and via somatic idioms, as I've mentioned before. We might dismiss traditional and complementary approaches without discussion. because there's a lack of evidence, even perhaps when they're causing no harm. Time pressures drive perhaps a fairly superficial surface level consultations, particularly if communication is a problem. If you're struggling to communicate with someone, are you really going to go through the biopsychosocial model of pain assessment with them? Probably not. And then we come to things like the cognitive behavior therapy based pain model that assumes a fairly secular individualist worldview of things. It may not land with a patient whose entire framework is a faith-centered, spirituality-centered, or collectivist. Patient level barriers. There may be low health literacy, there may be low pain literacy as well. They may not understand what their pain is about. They may not understand very basic pain neuroscience. They can sometimes foster fatalistic attitudes. Perhaps there's a fear of opioid stigma. And then there's the genuine kind of competing demand for putting the family ahead of oneself. So perhaps these patients are disengaging, not because they lack motivation, but because what we offer perhaps doesn't fit around them. So maybe this is a service design issue, not patient failure. So section 4 is just looking at culturally adapted pain education, because I feel this is absolutely crucial and perhaps is the foundation of any type of understanding and good self-care and self-management of any chronic disease. And this was the foundation when I helped set up the Rethinking Pain service in Bradford. Pain education was absolutely the foundation of the service, and we made it culturally adapted as well. And transformation is what actually changes good outcomes, doesn't it? If you transform someone's understanding of their pain and their chronic disease, it changes the outcome. So when we talked about pain neuroscience, we adapted it somewhat from the traditional way of looking at simple pain neuroscience. We changed around the metaphors. Instead of saying things like your nervous system is like a car alarm going off in the rain, that might land for some patients, but for Bradford patients, for those South Asian, your nervous system has become like an overactive parent, constantly warning you of danger, even when the danger is gone. That often seemed to land quite well with them. Family metaphors resonate quite powerfully in that collectivist culture. We started to incorporate perhaps spirituality and faith, and where we talked about the body as a trust from God. We reframed exercise and self-care and self-management as perhaps a religious obligation rather than a Western prescription. Caring for the body became an act of worship for some. And this is not a gimmick. We came together and we talked to patients, and this is what was their deepest motivation. Culture, faith really sits well and deep within patients' volition. On group programs, the practical barriers were addressable. We did have single gender groups, not very hard to organize, were quite transformative and had really good uptake, particularly in between school times, pickups and so forth. We had flexibility of schedules, we had halal food, we had vegetarian food, we had bilingual health workers, really important. And our health trainers and the people who deliver a lot of our modules on the Rethinking Pain were able to speak the local dialect and help people understand that bit better. We did videos in all sorts of different languages and animations and video resources and translations, absolutely to increase and improve someone's health literacy and particularly pain literacy. And we know that the evidence suggests that culturally adapted CBT-based programs show 30 to 40% better attendance and self-efficacy gains. And this is a substantial effect size. So it's not just about being nice and friendly and cuddly, it's about good clinical effectiveness, and the research backs that up. Protocol clinical approaches, everything so far has been in context. Now I want to just really quickly, and I appreciate the time is running quite quickly, what we can actually think about doing in our assessments. So I've got this, well, kind of made this up myself, to be honest, the CARE framework, 4 steps. applicable in any kind of consultation, no extra training required. C is for curiosity. Ask the questions that open a cultural context. What do you think is causing your pain? What does your family think about this? Because of that collectivist context, family illness beliefs are quite important. What have you already tried? Open the door to perhaps traditional remedies which can enter a conversation. And you can talk about efficacy of these treatments, but it just opens that door to good, effective communication. Acknowledgement. Validate the physical reality of pain first, always. The patient may suspect that you think it's all in their head, quote unquote. And if that occurs, the consultation is often over, isn't it? Whereas explaining it, acknowledging culture and beliefs with genuine respect really does help with acknowledgement. And then we talk about reframing. Often pain neuroscience concepts use language that just resonates with what matters to the patient. Connect to function, faith, and I always go back to this with patients. The goal isn't really zero pain. It's more about functional aspects. Are you able to be present with your children? That is what we're going to try and help you do. And that is what the treatment is for, along with things like physiotherapy, etc. Engage and empower. Co-create a plan as you would with any other patient that fits their life, not a fairly standard handout. Include community support. If you can, standardize and look at community support that's available in your local area. There's lots out there, particularly alongside the voluntary care sector. Make sure the materials that you use, whether it's websites or SMS messaging, make sure they're language appropriate, and that builds long-term trust. And there's lots of cases. I'm sure you can think of some yourselves, but I had a 52-year-old Pakistani woman who had widespread pain, low mood, was primary caregiver for elderly patient. We walked through this kind of care framework, took a couple of minutes, and it really just opened this door to further conversation and good self-care and good self-management. Last few slides. So there's lots of resource out there, which is kind of culturally adapted, including from the British Pain Society. The one website I would say perhaps, and I'm slightly biased in this, was the Rethinking Pain. Lots of videos on there, lots of information for patients. We've tried to make it quite wide and for different languages and dialects. Kind of breaks down simple, practical advice about movement, activity, diet, sleep, etc. I would ask you guys to review your patient information to make sure that you're able to cover those groups, perhaps where there's a majority in your patch, in your population. And the most common ones are Urdu, Punjabi, Hindi, Gujarati, and Bengali. Build relationships with local communities and faith organizations. That's really important, and they can often be quite a good asset for you and help patients self-care and self-manage. And I often ask pretty much every patient, what matters most to you about managing your pain? Moving away perhaps from trying to drop someone's pain on a pain scale to what's functionally important to them. Is it walking the dog? Is it going to play with grandkids? Is it looking after loved ones in the family? Is it making your way to a temple or a gurdwara? Or is it going to the mosque a couple of times a day? These are functional goals that people really respond to well. Okay, 5 quick takeaways. Culture is not a complication, it's context. It enriches your assessment and so engage with it. South Asian patients feel real specific structural barriers, not a lack of motivation. It's the framing that matters. Adaptation is more than translation. Metaphors, group formats, family involvement, scheduling, the framing of pain itself. Try and perhaps look at the creative care framework. Maybe use it tomorrow in your next clinic. Small changes make a massive difference. Perhaps audit your data, look at your patient populations. Do you actually document ethnicity? Once you've got the data, you can then move forward from there. And this is perhaps within pretty much every clinician's reach. Just some references, and that's it for the time being.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So thank you very much both to you, Asim, and you, Anna, from on behalf of the BPS and everyone who's attended the webinar today. We've got a few questions. I'll throw them out there if that's okay. I think this one's directed to you, Anna. What tips would you give to early career researchers starting out in healthcare inequities?
Great question. I think one, it depends where you are currently. So I won't talk about if you're particularly in the US right now, but it would be quite a different response practically. But one of the biggest things I actually say is I always think about finding your tribe or finding your community. Sometimes this work is difficult, it's challenging. It's also very rewarding. So having people who are doing this work alongside you, with you, particularly making sure that you have people with lived experience contributing and partnering with you. So thinking about how you can develop those skills would be one of the things I would say. I don't think you can do health equity work if you're not doing it in partnership and co-production. So that would be some of the trainings that I would think to try to lead you to be thinking about that. And then really just developing and thinking about where in this research do you want to go. One of the things, both good and bad, is that um, oftentimes people still aren't doing this work, doing this research. There is not enough of this work, and I find that quite strange as a scientist, thinking that if there's a scientific problem and challenge, normally we all try to run towards it, as you know, as we all are doing with AI right now, and thinking how people are running towards that, and yet we have this other really large issue that is affecting individuals across the world, and there's not enough work there. I think your research questions and your interests will definitely have a huge impact. So.
That's brilliant. Lovely. Thank you very much. I think one of the problems potentially is just how massive a topic this is. And I think you presented it really well, actually, the all of the layers that one has to consider when they look at inequities. And, that comes into how do we practically implement these kind of things? So, for example, you did mention cultural humility. How do you implement that in an organization?
Yeah, so one of the projects that we're currently funded through, so we have a NIHR, so a National Institutes of Health Research funded project, which is thinking about cultural responsivity, particularly thinking about in transition. So as our young people transition from pediatric to adult care, and this is around individuals with sickle cell. But really thinking about how do we think about sort of some Asim was talking about the community culture and collectivist culture in South Asian communities and Black communities, telling somebody that their child is at 16 as an adult and goodbye uh, is not going to work. That isn't how our communities work. That's not how families work. And so thinking about how you can incorporate that's cultural humility and having that within your practice. And it's not to say that cultural humility is that difficult. And I teach this to undergrads. A lot of the time they say to me, Anna, isn't that just being a good person? And at its core, it is because it's just valuing that the person in front of you is the expert in them and that you're the expert in pain, or in my case, sometimes it's thinking about mental health, but that we're going to come together and we're going to work on this together. And so you have to give up some power. You have to be able to do that. But ultimately, I think most of the time it is really as simple as just thinking, if I was in that spot, what would I want? And then if I don't know, asking and making sure that you're not making assumptions.
Yeah, 100%. Being a good person, it's a good motto, isn't it? Sometimes with the stress of healthcare, you can just miss that point, can't you? Asim, question about looking at cultural beliefs and how things change in second and third order immigrants. So, do you think there's any evidence that cultural beliefs and barriers discussed about pain are reduced if you're second and third generation immigrant populations? Does this help the situation? Does it cause multi-generational family tension? What are your thoughts on that?
So yeah, I looked at this a couple of years ago, and there's this concept of acculturation. I don't know, Anna might have heard of it. Yeah, and that is probably a very live phenomenon, really. So first generation, perhaps those who came in the 1960s or 70s, are slowly, fundamentally different from the second and third generations, and maybe even fourth generations now. And what the research suggests is that the immigrant populations who are born here, sorry, beg your pardon, second, third generations who are born here, tend to kind of mix the cultures between their resident where they were born and their the culture of their parents, for example. Yes, language was an issue. Now, most second and third generation immigrant populations who were born in this country can speak English. And so therefore that is one barrier we can kind of tick off, if that makes sense. Um, but the cultural aspects of it, it's really interesting. When they've looked at how society changes, um, if it becomes more right wing, um, people tend to stick closer together as a culture and families. And when it becomes quite left wing, there tends to be more introduction of new concepts, and people can kind of spread their it kind of gets diluted, if that makes sense. So yeah, in answer to the question, acculturation, absolutely, and it often means that they are adapting and acclimatizing to the culture they were born into, as opposed to the ones from their parents. I don't know if Anna's got any additional thoughts on that.
No, I think you explained it really well. That's
Yeah,
exactly sort of the cases. Some of the barriers are removed. The challenge is, just to say, on the other side. So the experience, the individual, their thought and the thought of who they are, oftentimes changes, right? Thinking about themselves, oftentimes as more British.
yeah,
But then the clinician or the other
exception.
person on the other side of the institution still not thinking of them that way, and so that's
Yes,
where the tension can arise.
100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. And probably a question for both of you. Just thinking more about the barriers of people who are listening to this, kind of implementing some of your ideas within their local practice. So, someone's commented there that we know that there are problems. We know that more time may need to be given to understanding different populations and serving them the best way that we can. But then we're clobbered with delivery of services. We're clobbered with with waiting lists and time to treat. Have you got any tips for how to balance that and how to make sure that we give the best experience, personal experience we can for people without kind of being smacked with the stick of, well, this is a low quality service because you're not getting through the workload that you should do?
Yeah. So I think often I work obviously pretty much all my work is in primary care, and there's a definite with the NHS 10-year plan and so forth. There's definitely a move now to move a lot of it, a fair amount of NHS services to the communities, and I think this will give us a real opportunity to perhaps reconfigure some of our pain services, just specifically from looking at from a pain aspect. Um, just like we've done in Bradford 3 or 4 years ago, just during COVID. And what we did was we looked at the current service provision and thought, this isn't quite working for our patient population. And then we involved the voluntary care sector and developed a completely different way of looking at pain, um, kind of outside the context of the NHS bubble, if that makes sense. And that made a difference. Commissioners, you have to get commissioners on board. You have to get local NHS and primary care on board, but it takes a bit of effort. But honestly, it worked, and the impact it's had on patients is absolutely phenomenal. Again, I'm biased, but we've had hundreds, if not thousands, of patients go through that service, and the obviously the feedback, the patient feedback is fantastic. So yeah, it is challenging, and resources. There's no new money out there. We all know that. But the way the NHS is going over the next 5 to 10 years, it will be more about neighbourhood services, and you don't need. And I'm going to say something now, Raj. You might disagree with. You don't need a pain service in a hospital, really. You don't, do you? You need it in a community. You need it in a community centre, a healthcare centre, perhaps a sports somewhere people can walk to with their family members. It's as simple as that. Those are the kind of things. It needs to be on a good bus route. Those are the kind of things which matter to patients, and that's what we've tried to do in Bradford. And honestly, it's worked. We've had little satellite kind of education support programs built up across the district, and little hubs almost, and it's worked really well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Anna, how about yourself in terms of how people go about kind of breaking down some of those barriers that you mentioned while still making sure that their service delivers up to the standards that it needs to?
Yeah, I think just to piggyback on what Asim said, I mean, because thinking about as a researcher and scientist, track the data, right? So, the better outcomes of hopefully will lead to, less contact, less, so tracking that data, I think is important. Any changes you make, making sure you track it because the evidence is widespread that when these practices are put into place, we see better outcomes. And then one of the things that I always teach on, I think, is that this idea of cultural humility is a practice that should be engaged for everybody who comes through your door. So if you're not switching and changing, the way you're going to be working for individuals, that you are always valuing an individual's culture, listening to them, thinking about how in your community, so Asim talks about in his community, that thinking about that collectivist culture is important, depending on where your practice might be, what's important there. If you're doing that for everybody who comes in, that becomes a little bit more automated, right? You are able then to do those things. There's a big uptick, right? The initial learning, don't get me wrong, I'm not discounting that would be challenging at first. But once you get into that, I definitely feel that if we are treating everybody who comes in as, an expert in their experience and valuing the things that are important to them, then that becomes part of just general practice, and it requires less. It will require a little bit less time. And then as I said, just track the outcomes as you do so.
Fantastic. Lovely. I think I'll bring the webinar to a close. So I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us this evening. Thank you very much for all your questions. Thank you for all your kind comments about our two speakers. Thank you once again to Asim and Anna. Please check out the BPS YouTube page tomorrow, and hopefully we'll see some of you at the ASM later on in the year. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.